They blocked the native elder at the sheriff's funeral. Then the Apache chief stepped out to salute him. The old man stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing clothes that didn't belong to any tribe anyone recognized. His weathered hands clutched something wrapped in faded cloth, something he refused to let go of even when the townspeople formed a wall between him and the casket. Everyone knew the rules here. Natives stayed on their side of the territory. White folks handled their own dead. It had always been that way. But then why were the women whispering behind their hands, pointing at the elder's face like they'd seen a ghost? Why did the mayor keep glancing nervously toward the hills, as if expecting something? The elder never spoke, never fought back when they pushed him away. He just stood there, staring at the sheriff's body with eyes that held secrets older than the town itself. And that's when the impossible happened. A shadow fell across the cemetery, not from clouds, from a man stepping forward from the crowd, tall, commanding, wearing the traditional dress of an Apache war chief, a man who hadn't been there moments before, yet somehow everyone recognized him instantly. The townspeople scattered backward like tumbleweeds in a storm, because chiefs like him didn't attend white funerals. They didn't cross into town borders. They certainly didn't walk up to random native elders and bow their heads in respect. But he did. And in that moment of silence, as the chief's eyes met the elders, something passed between them that made the sheriff's own deputy step back in shock. Some understanding that went deeper than blood, deeper than tribal law, deeper than any boundary line drawn in territorial sand. The question wasn't why they blocked the elder anymore. The question was why a feared Apache chief would risk everything to honor a stranger at a white man's funeral, and what the elder was carrying that made both men look like they were seeing the same ghost. The crowd held its breath as the Apache chief walked toward the elder. Every step echoed off the wooden buildings surrounding the cemetery, each footfall measured and deliberate. The townspeople pressed backward against the fence posts, their Sunday clothes suddenly feeling too tight, too formal for what was unfolding. Gideon Crow didn't move. His weathered fingers remained wrapped around the cloth bundle, his eyes fixed on the sheriff's still face inside the pine coffin. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his jaw worked silently, as if chewing on words he couldn't speak. The chief stopped 3 feet away. Up close, everyone could see the intricate beadwork on his vest, the silver bands around his wrists, the eagle feather tied to his long black hair. This wasn't some reservation Indian dressed in cast-off clothing. This was Malachi Whitmore himself, the war chief whose name parents used to quiet crying children at night. "You came," Malachi said, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery. Gideon's head lifted slowly. His dark eyes, clouded with age but sharp with intelligence, met the chief's steady gaze. "Had to." The mayor stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "Now see here. This is highly irregular. We have procedures." Malachi's gaze shifted to him, and the words died in the mayor's throat. The chief didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't even change expression. He simply looked at the man with the patience of someone who had watched empires rise and fall. The bundle in Gideon's hands rustled as his grip tightened. Several women in the crowd leaned forward, trying to glimpse what lay hidden beneath the faded fabric. One of them, a shopkeeper's wife, gasped softly and covered her mouth with her gloved hand. "Sarah?" her husband whispered. "What is it?" She shook her head, backing away from the cemetery fence. "I thought I saw, but it can't be. He's been dead 3 years." The deputy sheriff, a young man barely 20 with nervous hands and uncertain eyes, cleared his throat. "Chief Whitmore, sir. With all due respect, this is a private service for a friend," Malachi finished, never taking his eyes off Gideon. The word hit the gathered mourners like a physical blow. Friend. Not lawman, not enemy, not stranger. Friend. Gideon's shoulders began to shake. The cloth bundle trembled in his hands, and for a moment it seemed he might collapse entirely. But then he straightened, drawing himself up to his full height, still tall despite his years, and took a step toward the coffin. The townspeople instinctively moved to block him again, but Malachi raised one hand. A simple gesture, barely noticeable, yet it froze every person in place. "Let him pass." And as the crowd reluctantly parted, Gideon Crow walked toward the sheriff's body, carrying whatever secret had bound these 3 men together across the vast, unforgiving landscape of the territory. But the bundle in his hands was moving. The movement in the bundle stopped the entire ceremony cold. Every eye in the cemetery fixed on Gideon's hands as he approached the coffin. the faded cloth shifting and bulging with whatever he carried inside. A soft whimpering sound escaped the package. The pastor, a thin man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, stumbled backward from his position at the head of the grave. "What in the Lord's name?" Gideon knelt beside the sheriff's body, his ancient knees creaking against the wooden planks of the makeshift platform. With trembling fingers, he began to unwrap the cloth, revealing glimpses of something small and dark beneath. "Stop him," someone hissed from the crowd. "This ain't proper." But Malachi stepped closer, positioning himself between Gideon and the growing agitation of the townspeople. His presence alone held them back, though whispers rippled through the gathering like wind through dry grass. The final layer of cloth fell away. A tiny puppy, black with white markings, no more than 8 weeks old, lay curled in Gideon's palms. Its eyes were barely open, and it mewed softly as the morning light touched its fur. The animal was weak, clearly hungry, and shivered despite the elder's gentle hold. The crowd's confusion deepened. This was what had caused such fear, what had made grown men step back in terror. Gideon lifted the puppy toward the sheriff's still face. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks as he whispered words in a language none of the white settlers understood. The puppy sniffed weakly at the dead man's hand, then settled back into Gideon's palm with a tiny sigh. "He promised," Gideon said, his voice breaking. "Before the fever took him, he promised to see her safe." Sarah, the shopkeeper's wife, pressed closer to the fence despite her husband's restraining hand. "Her? That puppy belongs to—" "Quiet," Malachi commanded, his voice cutting through her words like a blade. But it was too late. The damage was done. Several people in the crowd had heard, had begun to piece together fragments of a story they thought they knew. Murmurs grew louder, more insistent. The deputy stepped forward again, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "Gideon, I think you'd better explain yourself. Sheriff Morrison died of fever, nothing more. What business did he have making promises to you?" Gideon stood slowly, cradling the puppy against his chest. The animal's breathing was shallow, labored. Time was running short for the tiny creature, and everyone present could see it. "The sheriff knew things," Gideon said simply. "Things about the raids last winter. Things about who was really behind the missing cattle. Things that would make certain folks in this town very uncomfortable if they came to light." The crowd shifted restlessly. Several men exchanged glances that weren't entirely innocent. Malachi watched these exchanges with the keen eye of a hunter reading tracks in the dirt. His presence at this funeral wasn't random, wasn't simply about paying respects to a dead lawman. He was here because the sheriff's death had left questions unanswered. Dangerous questions. "Sheriff Morrison was investigating something when he died," the chief said, his words falling into the tense silence like stones into still water. "Something that connects your town to missing Apache children." The temperature in the cemetery seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several women pulled their shawls tighter around their shoulders, and more than one man's hand drifted toward concealed weapons. But before anyone could respond, the puppy in Gideon's arms gave a final, weak cry and went completely still. The silence stretched until Gideon pressed his ear against the puppy's chest. A heartbeat, faint but steady, pulsed against his weathered skin. The tiny creature was unconscious, not dead, but barely clinging to life. "She needs milk," he whispered, looking up at the crowd with desperate eyes. "And warmth. Sheriff Morrison promised her mother she would live." The deputy's hand tightened on his gun grip. "Her mother? You're talking about a dog's mother like she was human," Malachi finished, his voice cutting through the deputy's words like winter wind. "The puppy belonged to a little Apache girl named Ayanna. She was 7 years old when she disappeared." Several men in the crowd shifted their feet, studying the ground with sudden intense interest. The mayor's face had gone pale behind his spectacles, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Sarah, the shopkeeper's wife, broke free from her husband's restraining grip and stepped toward the cemetery fence. "I have fresh milk at home. Goat's milk. It's what we used for our youngest when—" "Sarah, no," her husband hissed, grabbing her arm. "This isn't our concern." But she shook him off, her eyes fixed on the dying puppy in Gideon's hands. "That child, Ayanna, she used to come to our store. Sweet little thing, always carrying that puppy. She'd save scraps from her meals to feed it." "Used to come," Malachi repeated, his dark eyes scanning the faces of the townspeople. "Until 3 months ago, when she never made it home from your store." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Several men took an involuntary step backward, their hands moving to concealed weapons. The deputy's face flushed red, but whether from anger or guilt, nobody could tell. "Now you hold on there," the mayor sputtered, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "We've had no trouble with Apache folk. No reason to. Trade's been good for both sides." "Trade," Gideon repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. He stood slowly, still cradling the weakening puppy. "Is that what you call it when children disappear? When families are torn apart? Trade?" The pastor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "The sheriff came to me 2 weeks before he died. He was troubled, said he'd discovered something that would shake this town to its foundations. Something about contracts and shipments." "Shut up, preacher," one of the men in the back of the crowd growled. "Nobody asked for your sermon." But the pastor continued, emboldened by some inner conviction. "He showed me papers, bills of sale, things that should never be sold, signed by men I thought I could trust." Malachi moved closer to Gideon, and for the first time since arriving, his composure cracked slightly. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Where are those papers now?" the chief asked. The pastor's eyes darted nervously around the crowd. "Sheriff Morrison said he hid them somewhere safe, somewhere only his closest friends would think to look." Gideon's grip on the puppy tightened protectively. The tiny animal whimpered, struggling for each breath. Time was running out for the creature just as it had run out for her young owner. "The sheriff had 2 close friends," Gideon said quietly, his eyes meeting Malachi's across the grave. "One Apache, one white. He trusted us both with half the truth, which meant the evidence they needed was hidden in 2 separate places. And someone in this crowd would kill to keep it buried." The deputy drew his gun. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back echoed across the cemetery like a death sentence. "Nobody's going anywhere until we get some answers. Real answers." Malachi didn't flinch. He'd faced down cavalry charges and survived 3 bullet wounds in various battles. One nervous deputy with shaking hands posed little threat. But Gideon was another matter. The elder was old, carrying a dying animal, and surrounded by hostile townspeople. "Put the weapon down, boy," Malachi said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I ain't taking orders from no Apache," the deputy spat, though his gun barrel wavered slightly. The puppy in Gideon's arms gave a weak cry, barely audible above the tension crackling through the crowd. The sound seemed to pierce something in Sarah's heart, because she pushed past her husband entirely and marched toward the cemetery gate. "Enough," she declared, her voice sharp with maternal fury. "I don't care what secrets you men are carrying, but I won't stand here and watch a helpless creature die while you wave guns around like schoolboys." She reached Gideon's side and gently took the puppy from his hands. The tiny animal nestled against her warm shawl, its breathing shallow but steady. "My house is 2 blocks north. I have milk, blankets, and a warm stove." "Sarah, don't," her husband pleaded. "You don't understand what you're getting mixed up in." "I understand plenty, Thomas," she shot back. "I understand that little Ayana used to come to our store every week with her grandmother. Sweet child, always polite, always careful with her coins. And I understand she hasn't been seen since the day those men from back east came through town." The mayor's face went white as fresh snow. "Sarah, you're talking nonsense. There were no men from buyers," Gideon interrupted, his voice heavy with grief and anger. "Sheriff Morrison called them buyers, said they came through every few months looking for specific types of merchandise." The word hung in the air like a curse. Several women in the crowd gasped, finally understanding the true horror of what had been happening in their town. Children, Apache children, had been sold like livestock to men from distant cities. The deputy's gun hand began to shake more violently. That's not, we didn't know." "You knew," Malachi said, stepping closer to the young man. "The whole town knew. You just chose to look away because the money was good." Thomas, Sarah's husband, hung his head in shame. "The store was failing. We had debts. When they offered to pay premium prices for information about Apache families, about which children were healthy, intelligent, you provided shopping lists," Gideon said, the words coming out like a growl. Sarah clutched the puppy tighter, horror dawning in her eyes. "Thomas, what did you do?" "Just information," he whispered. "Names, ages, locations. I never thought they would actually—" But his wife was already backing away from him, the puppy pressed protectively against her chest. "You knew. You had to know what would happen to those children. The deputy, overwhelmed by the revelations and the weight of his own complicity, lowered his gun. Sheriff Morrison found out 3 weeks ago, started asking questions, making inquiries with federal marshals in territorial headquarters. So someone made sure he got sick, Malachi concluded. The deputy nodded miserably. Doc Henderson said it was natural fever, but the sheriff was healthy as a horse before he started investigating. Then suddenly he's burning up, talking out of his head, dead within a week. Gideon's hands clenched into fists. Poisoned. We can't prove it, the deputy said. But yeah, probably. The puppy stirred in Sarah's arms, making a soft sound that reminded everyone present of its young owner. Somewhere out there, Ayanna was either suffering in captivity or already dead, sold to men whose appetites didn't bear thinking about. The evidence, Malachi said quietly. Where did Morrison hide it? Gideon looked at the coffin, then at the crowd of guilty faces surrounding them. He said it was somewhere only a true friend would think to look. Somewhere that honored what we fought for together. The 3 men had been unlikely allies once, bound by a shared secret from years past. Now 2 remained, and the 3rd lay silent in his grave, taking half the truth with him, but not all of it. Sarah hurried toward her house with the puppy, several other women from the crowd following to help. The sight of their departure seemed to break the spell holding everyone in place. Men began shifting restlessly, eyeing the cemetery gates, calculating distances and escape routes. Nobody leaves, Malachi commanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Not until we find what Morrison hid. The mayor wiped his spectacles with shaking hands. This is highly irregular. You can't simply hold an entire town. Watch me, the chief replied. Gideon approached the sheriff's coffin, his weathered hands tracing the edge of the pine box. He always said if something happened to him. Look where honor was born. The deputy, still holding his lowered gun, frowned in confusion. Honor was born? What's that supposed to mean? But Malachi understood immediately, his dark eyes fixed on a spot beyond the cemetery, where an old stone marker stood half hidden by prairie grass. The boundary stone, where we signed the treaty. 20 years ago, when tensions between the Apache and the growing settlement had reached a breaking point, 3 men had prevented a war. Sheriff Morrison, barely a deputy then, had secretly met with Gideon Crow and Malachi Whitmore to negotiate a peace that saved lives on both sides. They'd signed their agreement in blood, not ceremonially, but because all 3 had been wounded in a skirmish just hours before the meeting. The boundary stone marked that sacred place. Gideon nodded grimly. He buried something there. Half the evidence. And the other half? Malachi asked. Somewhere that honors our friendship, Gideon said, his eyes moving to the grave itself. Under him, the crowd erupted in shocked protests. Disturbing a grave was sacrilege, illegal, unthinkable. But the mayor's face had gone gray, and he was backing toward the cemetery gate with obvious intent to flee. The deputy raised his gun again, this time pointing it at the mayor. Where do you think you're going? I had nothing to do with the children, the mayor stammered. I just signed the papers they brought. Official forms. I thought they were adoption documents. Adoption, Malachi said, the word dripping with contempt. Is that what you told yourself when you signed bills of sale for 7-year-old girls? Thomas emerged from behind a headstone, his face twisted with guilt and desperation. You don't understand the pressure we were under. The town was dying. No trade, no money, barely surviving each winter. When those men offered to pay for healthy children who wouldn't be missed. Apache children are always missed, Gideon said quietly. The deputy looked sick. How many? Thomas couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Over 2 years, maybe 15, maybe more. The number hit the gathering like a physical blow. 15 children, torn from their families, sold into slavery or worse. The puppy's weak cries from Sarah's house seemed to echo the pain of every missing child. Ayanna was the last, Thomas continued. Sheriff Morrison was getting too close, asking too many questions, so they said they needed to stop for a while. Until Morrison was dead, Malachi concluded. Thomas nodded miserably. Gideon walked to the boundary stone, his steps heavy with the weight of betrayal. The marker stood waist-high, weathered by 2 decades of prairie storms, but still bearing the faint marks where 3 men had pressed their bloodied hands in promise of peace. He began digging at its base with his bare hands, clawing through packed earth and grass roots. Within minutes, his fingers struck something solid, a wrapped bundle buried shallow in the ground. "Found it," he called. But as he pulled the package free, the sound of approaching horses thundered across the prairie, riders in dark coats moving fast toward the cemetery. The buyers had returned. 5 riders crested the hill overlooking the cemetery, their dark coats billowing behind them like storm clouds. Even at a distance, their intent was clear. These weren't mourners come to pay respects. They rode with the purposeful urgency of men who had urgent business to conduct. Gideon tore open the wrapped bundle with trembling fingers. Inside lay a leather journal, its pages filled with Sheriff Morrison's careful handwriting, and beneath it, a stack of official documents bearing territorial seals and signatures. Names, he breathed, scanning the pages. Routes, prices, everything. Malachi moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. The chief's face darkened as he absorbed the contents. They weren't just taking Apache children. Orphans from the settlement, too. Anyone who wouldn't be missed. The deputy stepped closer, his gun still drawn but now pointing toward the approaching riders rather than the townspeople. "How many are in that group?" "5 that I can see," Malachi replied, shading his eyes against the morning sun. "Probably more circling around to block the roads." The mayor made another attempt to flee, but Thomas grabbed his arm. "You're not leaving us to face this alone. You signed those papers. You take responsibility." "I didn't know what would happen to them," the mayor whined. "You knew enough," Gideon said, continuing to read through Morrison's notes. "Says here you received $50 per child. Good money for signing adoption papers, wouldn't you say?" The riders were close enough now to make out individual faces. Hard men with weathered features and cold eyes, the kind who measured human worth in dollars and cents. Their leader, a tall man with a silver beard, raised his hand in what might have been a greeting, but felt more like a threat. "Morning, folks," he called as they reached the cemetery fence. "Lovely day for a funeral. Mind if we pay our respects?" The deputy raised his weapon. "This is a private service. You'll need to move along." The silver-bearded man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Oh, I think we have business with some of the folks here, particularly the gentleman with the bundle and our Apache friend." "Business is concluded," Malachi said, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "I'm afraid not. See, we had an arrangement with Sheriff Morrison, a mutually beneficial arrangement. When he passed so suddenly, certain commitments went unfulfilled." Gideon looked up from the journal. "Commitments like delivering children to you, among other things," the man agreed. "We understand there's a particular little Apache girl who was promised to us. 7 years old, goes by the name Ayana. Very specific request from a client back east." The casual way he discussed a child's fate made several of the townswomen gasp in horror. Even some of the men who had been complicit in the scheme looked sick at hearing it spoken so plainly. "She's already gone," Thomas blurted out. "Taken east 2 weeks ago." The silver-bearded man's smile faded. "That's not what our sources tell us. Word is she's been hidden somewhere local, protected by folks who don't understand the consequences of interfering with our business arrangements." Malachi's grip tightened on his knife handle. "What consequences?" "Well, let's see. Towns that don't honor their commitments tend to have unfortunate accidents. Fires, mostly. Amazing how quickly wooden buildings burn when the wind's right. The threat hung in the air like smoke. These men weren't just criminals. They were terrorists, using fear and violence to control entire communities." Gideon closed the journal and tucked it inside his shirt. "The sheriff's evidence tells a different story. Federal marshals will be very interested in your business arrangements." "Federal marshals," the man laughed. "Son, we've got judges and territorial officials on our payroll from here to Washington. Your little book won't change anything." But Gideon smiled grimly. "This book will, because it's not the only evidence." He looked toward the sheriff's grave, where the second half of Morrison's documentation lay buried with the man who died protecting it. The silver-bearded man followed his gaze and understood immediately. His hand moved to the gun at his hip. "Boys," he said quietly to his companions, "looks like we're going to need some shovels." The silver-bearded man dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with authority. "Deputy, I suggest you lower that weapon before someone gets hurt unnecessarily." "I suggest you get back on your horse and ride out," the deputy replied, though his voice cracked slightly. He was young, outnumbered, and facing men who killed for a living. 2 of the riders began circling the cemetery, positioning themselves to block any escape routes. The other 2 dismounted and started toward the sheriff's grave, pulling shovels from their saddlebags. "Stop right there," Malachi commanded, stepping into their path. The silver-bearded leader laughed. One Apache against 5 armed men? Even for a war chief, those aren't favorable odds. But Malachi wasn't alone. Sarah emerged from her house, no longer carrying the puppy. Behind her walked 3 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, carrying rifles and moving with the silent grace of men born to fight. "How about 5 against 5? Malachi asked. The trafficker's confident smile faltered. "This is private business, no concern of yours." "Missing children are always our concern," one of the warriors replied in perfect English. Gideon clutched Morrison's journal against his chest, his mind racing. The evidence in his hands could destroy the entire trafficking network, but only if it reached the territorial authorities. These men would kill everyone present to keep their secret safe. "The girl," he said suddenly. "Ayanna. Where is she?" Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "Safe, hidden where men like you can't touch her." The silver-bearded man's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That child is promised goods. She belongs to us by legal contract." "Children don't belong to anyone," the deputy said, finding his courage. "And no contract makes slavery legal in this territory. Legal depends on who's enforcing the law," the trafficker replied. "And we own enough badges and judges' robes to make anything legal." That's when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the prairie again. But this time the riders wore different uniforms, blue cavalry coats with territorial marshal badges gleaming in the morning sun. Thomas, the shopkeeper, looked confused. "Who sent for the marshals?" "I did," Sarah said quietly. 3 weeks ago, when Sheriff Morrison asked me to deliver a message if anything happened to him. The federal authorities have been investigating reports of missing children throughout the territory." The silver-bearded man's face went white with rage. "You interfering witch. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've saved children," Sarah replied firmly. The lead marshal rode through the cemetery gate, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Gentlemen, ladies, I'm Marshal Wade Langston. We're here investigating reports of human trafficking and the suspicious death of Sheriff Morrison." The traffickers were trapped. 5 Apache warriors blocked one side, federal marshals blocked another, and the townspeople, finally understanding the full horror of what they'd enabled, formed a third barrier of angry faces. "Marshal," Gideon called, holding up Morrison's journal. Sheriff Morrison documented everything: names, dates, routes, payments. "It's all here." The silver-bearded man made a desperate grab for his gun, but Malachi was faster. The war chief's knife flew through the air, striking the trafficker's wrist and sending his weapon spinning into the dirt. "It's over," Marshal Langston announced, dismounting with his deputies. "You're all under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, and the murder of a territorial law officer." As the marshals began placing the traffickers in shackles, Gideon walked to the sheriff's grave. Morrison had died protecting these children, sacrificing his life to expose the truth. The least they could do was let him rest in peace with his secret intact. "We don't need what's buried with him," Gideon said, patting the journal. "This is enough." But one question remained unanswered, the one that had brought them all together at this funeral. 2 hours later, the cemetery was quiet again. The traffickers had been loaded into a prison wagon and taken east to the territorial capital, where federal judges waited to hear their cases. Marshal Langston assured everyone that with Morrison's evidence, convictions were certain. Thomas and the mayor sat in shackles near the cemetery fence, awaiting their own transport. Their cooperation in the investigation might reduce their sentences, but both men faced years in territorial prison for their roles in the trafficking scheme. "The children," Marshal Langston said to Gideon and Malachi. "Sheriff Morrison's notes indicate at least 15 were taken over 2 years. Do you know their whereabouts?" Gideon nodded grimly. "Some were sold east to private buyers. Others went to mining camps out west, where no one asks questions about workers' ages. Most—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "We'll find the ones who can still be saved," the marshal promised. "This journal provides enough detail to track the routes and identify the buyers." A small voice called from the direction of Sarah's house. "Grandmother?" Everyone turned to see a young Apache girl running toward them, her black braids flying behind her. She was thin, clearly hadn't eaten well in weeks, but her eyes were bright and alive. In her arms, she carried a small black and white puppy, stronger now, fed and warm. "Ayanna," Malachi breathed, dropping to one knee as the child ran to him. She threw her arms around the war chief's neck, tears streaming down her face. "I thought they would take me away forever. Mrs. Sarah hid me in her root cellar, but I was so scared." Sarah approached, wiping her own tears. She's been hidden in my house for 3 weeks. When Sheriff Morrison brought her to me the night before he got sick, he said terrible men were coming for her. I couldn't let that happen. Gideon knelt beside Malachi and Ayanna, his weathered face soft with relief. Your puppy missed you. She's been very brave, just like her owner. Ayanna buried her face in the puppy's fur, whispering Apache words of love and comfort. The tiny animal responded with happy whimpers and gentle licks. The deputy, no longer trembling, approached the group. Marshal, what happens to folks like us? People who knew something was wrong but didn't speak up? Marshal Langston considered the question carefully. That depends. Are you willing to testify against the others? Help us find the missing children? Yes, sir. Whatever it takes. The pastor stepped forward. Our whole town failed those children. We let fear and greed blind us to suffering happening right under our noses. How do we make amends for that? Malachi looked up from comforting Ayanna. You start by telling the truth. All of it. Then you help us bring the missing ones home. Sarah nodded emphatically. And we establish a fund. Every family in town contributes to help the survivors rebuild their lives. As the marshal and his deputies prepared to leave with their prisoners, Gideon and Malachi stood together beside Sheriff Morrison's coffin. The lawman could finally be laid to rest properly, his mission complete. He kept his promise. Gideon said quietly, She's safe. All of them will be safer now, Malachi replied. The evidence he gathered will destroy this network completely. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 old warriors who had found peace through shared loss and shared purpose. The treaty they'd signed 20 years ago had prevented a war. Today their friendship had saved children's lives. The puppy barked once from Ayanna's arms, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the cemetery. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll, not in mourning but in celebration. Sheriff Morrison's funeral could finally begin, this time with honor, truth, and justice properly served. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.